Today I'm here with James Palmer, who's packing his bags and leaving Hawke's Bay to become the Chief Executive of the Ministry for the Environment. Thanks for being with us, James. We want to pull a bunch of information out of you before you leave town here. I'd like to talk to you first about your role as a manager. You came here out of a lengthy career, extensive career as a senior executive in central government. You plopped down here in the province. What's different about that? Any surprises?
Well, the first thing that really surprised me, Tom, was that in central government you have different departments of state doing the many and very different functions that you need to run a government. You've got the Inland Revenue collecting tax and the Treasury managing the money, and you have contestable lines of advice from Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and then you have the Cabinet Office managing the governance and Parliament managing the decision-making processes, etc. And I could go on. And what I wasn't quite prepared for is how all of those functions all have to be done by one institution within a council. So you've got to raise your own revenue, and you've got to manage all of your financial side of things, as well as then having to support running your own elections and supporting your own governance processes. And then in the regulatory side of things, you do everything from setting policy right through to taking prosecutions. So the complexity of the business surprised me, and the extent to which you have to be self-sufficient in running the institutions. So you really have to think about running a mini government for the region, and that's no small undertaking.
As opposed to being able to focus more narrowly on the policy issues involved and so on. So what did you learn out of all of that once you jumped in?
Well, I learned that local government has an enormously challenging, diverse, complex and big job to do in statutes. So the Regional Council, for example, has got responsibilities for civil defence, for navigational safety, has to provide public transport for the region, has to manage all the natural resources, respond to adverse events and provide civil defence, and I could go on. And the complexity of all of that being put on relatively small institutions that need to be funded from a relatively small population base is a big challenge for New Zealand. And we ask a lot of local government. And I think one of the things we're seeing through Three Waters reform and the inquiry into the future for local government is a recognition that we've asked more and more and more of these institutions over time. And the complexity of the job suggests that actually we need the scale, both in terms of the financial strength of the institutions, but also the management and technical capability to do these jobs, more professionally in the next century than perhaps in the last.
So when you got here, the staff of this organization was what?
It's about 190.
And now?
345.
345. And all of that, I mean, the council in this last, how many years, 6, 7 years that you've been here, has been pretty successful at bringing money into the region out of central government, but still, that's a lot of people to fund. And as you say, in this role, you bear some responsibility for raising that money. Your elected councilors really bear that responsibility, but is that a big distraction? Is the money, the availability of money and the stress and strain around money, is that a big headache?
Look, I think it's going to be more of a headache in the coming years than it was during my tenure. I was fortunate that most of my leadership of this organisation occurred during a period of strong economic growth and prosperity in the region, pre-COVID. And it was at a time when, post the controversies of the Rui Taniwha water storage scheme, which put a real focus on water quality and water management issues in the region, and then the Havelock North water contamination event also focused people's minds on what are we doing with fresh water. That, combined with a growing appreciation of the climate risks and impacts for the region, and things like biodiversity loss happening at the global scale but also being a regional issue, those growing as priorities for the community, alongside a strong economic base, has made it reasonably straightforward to make the case or the value proposition for increasing the investment in the regional council. I think going into the next few years, we're getting to the point where the cumulative burden on ratepayers from increasing rate burdens of the territorial councils as well as the regional council, also going into potentially a more difficult economic backdrop, may make it harder for the regional council to continue to raise revenue in the way it has up until now.
Can you recall offhand what the average take from a Hawke's Bay resident is by the regional council?
So when I started, the average was about $150, and it's approaching $300 a year now.
So 300.
Yeah.
So in my case, I have a rural lifestyle block, and I'm paying the Hastings Council around $2,500. So it seems like I've always felt like a lot more got done for my $300 than my $2,500. But do you get a lot of pushback from constituents about regional council rates?
So we haven't, and I think largely because the nominal sum is still quite low when you think about it for a typical ratepayer, urban ratepayer paying something like $300 a year. That's what you pay for the protection and the management of the environment, the natural resources of the region, and also managing the natural hazards, if you like. If we look at our flood schemes, for example, the return on investment for the community in terms of the protection of literally billions and billions of dollars worth of property and assets is extremely good. So I think that the nominal dollars has been sufficiently low that people have not begrudged paying another $50, $60, $70 a year. But what does attract attention from time to time is the percentage increase. And we have got ratepayers who feel that the percentage increase has been inordinate. What I think we may not have communicated adequately for them is it's not just managing cost inflation. What we've been doing is significantly increasing the capability of this organisation to manage things that previously were not particularly actively or well managed.
So we'll get into some of those policy areas in a little more depth here, but still at the 50,000 foot level. So you came in right at the heels of the Ruatanifa Dam controversy, which consumed a lot of everybody's political attention and capital, but pretty much came with an opportunity to look at a clean slate. And so, you look back now, is it 6 years?
So 5.5 years as chief executive, and I was in the organisation at the second tier for about 18 months prior to that. So I've been with the regional council for 7 years now.
So you came in, okay, this huge controversy is kind of still simmering a bit, but it's kind of resolved, and you look around, and what did you think? What did you think you would have to do first?
I was surprised at the damage to trust and confidence in the institution. I hadn't appreciated the extent of that and how deep the feelings were in the community about what had occurred. Similarly, the Havelock North water contamination event had a huge impact on our community in terms of well-being, but also I think psychologically, people's trust in the institutions that are there to look after them was severely damaged. So I made a priority from the get-go resetting the relationship, and I knew that was going to take time. But what was important to me was to be very transparent and honest about the strengths and weaknesses of the organisation, acknowledge where we had failed previously, and talk about how we were going to build a better council to provide more trust and confidence around the functions that we have. So that was an early priority. Part of that is around how you communicate externally and how you use science and information and evidence to paint a picture, if you like, about the reality of what's going on in our region. And I think during my time we've been a lot more candid with our community about the state of our environment, about our degraded waterways, about where we've over-allocated, the state of our biodiversity. And we've talked also with our community more honestly about the effects of climate change. So I think we've been able to reset that, and that was a priority and has been a big focus of my tenure.
And I guess we midstream there at some point we shifted central government leadership. And did you feel a new surge of interest in the kinds of issues that local government deals with when the Labour Party took over?
So freshwater reform has been in motion since about 2011. That was when the first national policy statement came out that said that regional councils needed to set water quality and quantity limits. So that process had begun, but what we saw with the Labor government and David Parker becoming Minister for the Environment is he brought forward the timelines and really set about turbocharging the freshwater reform process, including bringing in a number of regulations around things like stock exclusion and managing intensive winter grazing and cultivation on slope, and a bunch of things which now are being rolled out by way of stronger regulations. So the focus on freshwater got tougher, faster, and the other thing that we saw was a real shift in the focus on climate change. So particularly with the Green Party Minister James Shaw driving a bigger focus on climate change, both in terms of adaptation and mitigation, that has put regional councils now more squarely at the front line of a changing climate.
You referred to the Havelock North issue, water issue. You also walked into a setting, you referred earlier to, in central government, what you face are competing ministries with different priorities and objectives, and here, that competition, you could look at it in terms of 4 other councils to deal with. Talk about that a bit. What challenges that presented?
One of the things that was revealed in the Havelock North water contamination event was that historically the councils in the region had largely tried to stay out of each other's way. Historically, there'd been a lot of tension between the regional council and the district councils, and that was really a view that the regional council was getting in the way of district councils doing what they needed to do or managing their own infrastructure, and there was a bit of resistance to regional councils undertaking their role overseeing the performance, if you like, of district councils. Now that resulted in a bit of a standoff, and what we saw in Havelock North was both the district council and the regional council not adequately doing their jobs and things falling in between the cracks in between the two agencies. That was a very sobering experience for both institutions, and what we saw come out of the back of that was a commitment by the regional leaders and by the chief executives of the councils of the region to never let that happen again and work much more closely together. What I've observed is an increasing maturity in the territorial authorities around understanding that the regional council's got a job to do, that we are here to protect the environment, to protect our communities from natural hazards, and we've got a regulatory function that sits over the top of district councils. So from a time when there was much acrimony, when we would take regulatory or enforcement action against a territorial authority, now it's understood that everyone's just doing their part in the job, and the relationships now are really positive, and we collaborate on many issues, and I think it's much stronger than it's ever been.
A reassuring thing to hear. As a former councillor, I find it hard to accept, but it does seem to me that the tough challenges of the region are regional, and they wind up here anyway. And so it does seem like there's been an accretion of responsibility, whether the territorial authorities like it or not, in civil defense or tourism or now economic development and a variety of other places. But you seem quite positive about this 5 council arrangement. There is a local government review underway, although now who knows with change of government possible whether that will have any legs. Do you see this as the best model for Hawke's Bay?
I think
you can say what you think. You're leaving.
Look, I think there are some advantages of having some structurally inbuilt tensions between having an environmental regulator, if you like, and then the territorial authorities providing infrastructure and services. where there's some independence around that environmental regulation. So, for example, for Hastings or Napier to collect wastewater from households and discharge that into the environment, that has to sit under a resource consent framework administered by the regional council. And I think you have a risk when the poacher is gamekeeper and you don't have enough tension in that relationship for the environment perhaps to become second order to economic or to social concerns. So there are some benefits in having the structure that we have at the moment. But what I think is quite evident is that the growing requirements on local government, as I said earlier, are becoming of an order of magnitude, and the complexity of running these organisations is such that scale is an issue. And we do have some very small councils, and if we do have Three Waters reform and those assets, the Three Waters assets, leave the district councils, there is a big stranded overhead component in the funding of those organisations, and that's going to force more and more collaboration. Whether or not we need to rationalise the governance is in my mind a separate question. I think in terms of the corporate side of running councils, there's greater opportunity to work more closely together so that we don't have multiple payroll systems and multiple HR functions and multiple teams doing compliance or consent processing. But you could get more efficiency and more aggregation in those functions while still retaining the representation of local communities and decision making at that level. So there is the possibility of some sort of hybrid model, and I know that's partly what the Future for Local Government panel is contemplating.
It seems inescapable, though, that when you look at the costs involved just in the water area for Central Hawke's Bay or Wairoa. I mean, when Wairoa had to get a fresh consent for its water treatment, they basically came before you guys and said, we can't afford to do any more than X, and X was not very much. And so going forward, it does seem like these big infrastructure requirements of the region are going to have to be financed in some different way than by their local territorial tax base or rate base. I don't know what the answer to that is, because such hysteria has been whipped up around Three Waters in particular by, in some cases, the people who are least able to afford it for their own populations. But anyway, we'll see where that goes.
Look, I agree. There's a huge affordability issue looming for New Zealand around Three Waters, and it's not an affordability for the whole country, as you say. It's an affordability issue for our smaller communities. We significantly subsidise and cross-subsidise nationally roading, so central government provides our small councils with large subsidies to provide their roading networks. Most of the electricity networks throughout New Zealand were built with a huge amount of cross-subsidy. We wouldn't have power to many of our most of our rural farms and rural communities if there hadn't been that cross-subsidy, because it would be inordinately expensive to charge everybody the actual cost of providing to their home. So we've had this approach in New Zealand of cross-subsidy, which has enabled us as a country to have high living standards with a relatively fragmented and small spread out population. Three Waters has been treated a bit differently. There was a significant amount of local government subsidy from central government in the 1950s and 60s, even through towards the 1980s. But more latterly, we have not had those subsidies, and now the investment's required. So, look, I think change is going to need to occur. The question is really, what does the governance look like on that? What's the retention of control and influence by local communities over service provision? And there are some trade-offs in that. And I would say when you talk about Hawke's Bay's local government landscape more generally, that's part of the trade-off picture that we need to think through. We do have two cities very, very close together. We increasingly have Central Hawke's Bay as almost a dormitory suburb of Hastings and Napier now. And so these towns are incredibly interconnected economically, socially. Many people live in Hastings, work in Napier, vice versa. And of course the rest of the country think Hawke's Bay, they don't think Napier, Hastings. The region's identity is very much as a region. So one of our challenges is how do we rise above our potentially parochial views about identity, the smaller place that we live in, and think about what makes sense in terms of the planning and the economic infrastructure and the economic development of the region, which probably needs to happen at a bigger scale than has traditionally done so.
So we do live in a democracy, and the issues you're describing are pretty complex and getting even more so. Do you think the public has any real appreciation of the difficulties of making these calls?
I don't think the community understands all of what local government does, and I don't know that we do a good enough job explaining all that we deal with and the complexity of the trade-offs and the decision making. One of the things that surprised me about coming into this job, and to some extent has been a source of frustration, has been the extremely low levels of trust in the institution. I was born and raised here. I'm passionate about Hawke's Bay. I had an environmentalist background. I came into this role simply really wanting to protect the region's environment and to make it better. And of all of the staff that work at the Regional Council, they're all passionate about that mission. We've got ecologists and scientists and engineers and people who spend their whole careers all about protecting or enhancing the environment that they love too. And yet within the community, large pockets of the community, there's a very dim view about the council. And it's often based on past history, but also a misunderstanding, I think, about how we as an organisation and our governors have to balance an awful lot of competing interests. And so it's quite easy if you have a very narrow view as an economic extractor of resources, or if you're a staunch environmentalist, or that you're mana whenua and you're most concerned about your cultural identity and your cultural connection to the environment, to think that the Regional Council or any of the councils don't care about your issues or are in the pocket of one interest or the other. Of course, what we have to do is balance all of those competing interests and try to move the community forward in a way which makes progress for the environment, is more sustainable, etc., while sustaining an economy. All of that is complex and difficult, and typically there's no right answer. Science doesn't give you perfect answers to these things. These are about judgment calls, and our elected councillors have an enormous burden to weigh a whole bunch of evidence, uncertainty, and then have to make long-term decisions that require an awful lot of judgment and calibration around, what can the community sustain? What can the environment sustain? These are difficult choices. So you would like the community to, come on, give us a break here. It's a tough job. And if you are going to be critical, do your homework. Look, one of the things that I think is worrying for public institutions globally right now, and is a very current and topical issue with respect to the treatment that the Prime Minister has received during her tenure, is that the trust and confidence in public institutions is continuing to fall. And there are a bunch of issues around social media and the way in which that amplifies voices in the community, and the extent to which people in the community with often very little information or understanding have increasingly strong and strident views about our public institutions. And I think those who are reasonably well informed and who are reasonable understand that on most issues there actually isn't an easy answer, and that there's a whole bunch of competing values and objectives that society has, and it takes an awful lot of weighing and navigating. And so I think we have those in the community that understand the job of government, central, local, regional, is challenging, is difficult, but we also have those in the community who probably have overly simplistic views about how simple the many issues that we face could be solved, and that we're all a bunch of plonkers for not just getting on and doing what they believe. And that I think is going to be a growing challenge for us about how we engage our communities in civics education, and the history of the country, understand the complexity of what we're dealing with, and take people forward together together I guess in a more empathetic and understanding way as they interact in the democratic process.
Let's wade into two issues that will test what you just said there. Obviously, water in all of its manifestations and issues raised is a huge issue here, very controversial. What does make it so difficult? Is it lack of reliable science or debatable science? Is it just competing value systems? What's the nature of where does the intensity come from around those issues?
We're really blessed here in Hawke's Bay that we've got a really strong science understanding of our water resources, and one of the things I'm particularly proud of my time here as the Chief Executive is we've built that information evidence base substantially off the back of decades of hard work as well. But we're really well positioned as a region to understand our fresh water and what's going on with it and to make decisions off the back of that. But as I said before, science really gives you an answer. It helps informs the questions and can inform the choices. But there are huge value questions in all of this. And I think water is so fundamental to all of us. We all depend on it daily for our lives. It's very intimate, our relationships with it. And so for many people, well, for everybody, it's important. But for many people, it's especially important because it underpins their livelihood, particularly in the irrigated and agricultural sector. A huge amount of our food processing and industry depend on fresh water. And lots of people use it for recreation. So as Kiwis, we love our lakes, our rivers, our coastal environment. We play in water, we use it recreationally. And for Māori, for tangata whenua, it could not be more fundamental. So, water is central to the notion of whakapapa, where people derive from. And there's so many cultural practices relate to the freshwater body that historically and traditionally Māori lived beside. It was a form of a food source, a form of transport. Absolutely central to Te Ao Māori. So really important for our tangata whenua. So for everybody, there's a lot at stake. And I think one of the things that really has amplified the tensions has been the first served approach we've had historically around the allocation of water. And that's resulted in great inequities. So some in the community have vast amount of water at their disposal for which they pay very little other than maybe an annual consent and science monitoring fee, and are able to develop significant economic value, or derive significant economic value from that water allocation. Others in the community have no water. We have rural communities, particularly some of our Māori communities, and you can think about Bridgepa, for example, where the community is water short, and they feel greatly aggrieved that what is owed to them under the Treaty of Waitangi, what historically was theirs culturally to use, is now used by others for great economic benefit for what they feel shut out from. So first and first served, I don't think has been particularly equitable, and it hasn't necessarily been economically rational. Water hasn't always gone to the most productive or resilient use, and it's also we've over-allocated as a result of the salami slicing of giving out water over time without a good understanding about what's the overall sustainability of that allocation.
Mm-hmm. So I hear you saying if you stay calm and look at the available science, that should remove some grounds of dispute. The numbers should be believable. But then you come up against a set of value differences and grievances that are pretty profound and not going to go away. But even, I mean, in your case, you're about to publish a 50-year water scenario, demand and supply in Hawke's Bay. And as I look at that, still embedded in it, yes, you can say we have a better science understanding of things, but embedded in it are, when you then try to look forward, are assumptions about economic growth, what form it's going to take or whatever, climate change and what the impact of that will be, what the contribution of technology could be in terms of better use of the resource and what have you. And you wind up with, in that report, a variety of scenarios that on the one hand say, oh my God, the sky's falling, we need 100 million cubes or whatever. And on the other hand, a scenario that says, actually we'll need less water in 50 years if we do the maximum optimal use of it. So how does that really clarify, I mean, the situation to look at, all right, we've put a hell of a lot of effort into understanding what this future could look like, but the spectrum is so wide. How does that advance resolving these issues?
So what the regional water assessment tries to demonstrate is that if we keep going as we are and we do nothing, we're going to massively overshoot the available resource. Demand is going to grow and grow and grow on our current behaviours and our current economic growth model and our mindset around just extracting more and more water. And it tries to demonstrate that there is no more water, so that change is going to be required. And then it tries to paint, I guess, an optimistic picture of the fact that if we change fundamentally how we manage water, there can be enough for all of our needs and uses. We're incredibly profligate as a society with our use of fresh water. We don't value it nearly as much as we should. And so it tries, the regional water assessment tries to set the platform for a conversation around significant change. And the challenge that we face as an organisation and as a region is that because of the first in, first served approach we've now grandparented into our landscape, if you like, water use practices. And I guess culturally we've all become accustomed to water being freely available, readily available when we need it. We've built a bunch of practices both at individual level but also at industrial and community level, which is unsustainable. And so it's how do you unwind all of that? And that is going to be a long-term, multi-decadal project for this region. We do believe that climate change will bring us overall less water. We'll get times when it comes pouring down and we'll have flood events, but the water will come and go quickly. And if we can't capture that, we'll overall have less water and we'll have a hotter, drier climate. That will increase demand, particularly for our irrigation and horticulture. So we're staring down the barrel of water becoming much more scarce and creating a big economic, social and environmental challenge for the region. So we're trying to enlist the community in a conversation around the fact that the way we've operated in the past cannot be the way we're going to operate in the future.
So you still, though, have a wide range of views as to what is our love affair with growth all about. And if I maybe oversimplify, there is a Maori view that we should live within what nature provides, period. And no other interventions should occur that sort of violate that principle. So certainly big infrastructure projects get cast in a very negative light if you have that worldview. And if you've overallocated the water, the answer is simple: take it back. And that's the natural course of things. And then the other end, you have folks who, you have Rockton Apple that's, going gangbusters and what have you, and growth. And then you have a part of the community that says, do we really want this growth? So you have people like Greg Hart and Bruce Bissett and David Trowbridge and others saying, well, we don't, let's put a cap on it and call it a day and be self-sufficient. And you have a Maori view also that says you can't put a price on water, the most valuable asset we have, arguably, or resource need we have. But you can't put a value on it. Well, how can you ever efficiently use it if you don't put a value on it? These issues seem so intractable. And you've been dealing with them here regionally. You're going to step out of here, and they're on the desk as well, and even more so in your new job. what are you carrying away from here that will help you tackle these issues on a bigger scale?
Well, you've quite articulately just described what I'm carrying away, which is that, I guess, that confluence of or conflict, if you like, of values and worldviews about what the solutions are really. We've got those within the economy that want to grow their private enterprise, want to grow their businesses, and they'll have a view that our existing water can be used much more efficiently and get more productivity from it. New varieties of apples irrigated more efficiently and effectively, and see that as part of the solution. And so there's a technology picture to all of that. There are those that see, I guess, technology and our use of our natural resources as the problem, and want to see either a cap on that or a winding back on that. What I've learnt in my time here is partly that science doesn't answer all the questions, but also that there's no right answer in terms of what is a sustainable rate of the use of fresh water, say here in the Hiritonga plains system. Hiritonga is a fascinating example of how difficult it is to derive a right answer in terms of how much water can we truly take. It's not just a question of how much water falls from the sky and how much goes to the ocean and how much can we afford to take before there's none left. It's actually a much more complex set of questions around the relationship between our groundwater, our surface water, the extent to which our lowland streams can flow and flourish during a dry summer event, and the impact that all of our takes have on fresh water, that dynamic situation that changes through the year. And we're in a situation where the environment is completely modified. So Hiritonga Plains, historically, a huge wetland system that had a lot of fresh water at the surface. We've drained it all. We've cut drains for our towns, our rural environments, massively modified the holding capacity of the soil and the land, and we now try to get water out as fast as we can when it rains too much, so we don't flood our towns or our crops. But then when we want it, when it's dry, we then try to pull it out of the ground as fast as we can. We have completely changed the system. And so re-engineering the system is not just as simple as cutting back. We could cut back significant amounts of allocated water in Hiritonga and still end up with massive environmental problems every summer. So we actually need to confront some more long-term strategic choices about our relationship with the environment more broadly, about our soils. How do we keep water in our landscapes more through changing our land use practices? How do we change in our households the way we conceive of water, whether everybody has a lawn that needs to be kept green through the summer, these sorts of things. So we actually have to think quite differently, and that is going to be a lot longer term proposition. How rapidly we change, I think, will be driven by climate change. Our Director of Water Security in the region, Tom Belford, likes to say that the physics is going to overtake the politics, which is to say that a changing climate is going to force behavioural change, whether it be in our farming communities or in our urban communities, faster than probably politics and policy can keep up with. At the moment, one of my great frustrations in this role, particularly on freshwater management, is our resource management system. Personally, I believe it's broken and it does need being reformed, and certainly those reforms are before Parliament at the moment, and we'll be working hard, and I'll be working hard in my new job to get a much better system. It's extraordinary when you think about the tank plan change here in Hiritonga, where you have a situation where the council invested in a community collaborative process involving a wide range of stakeholders. It spent nearly 2 years deliberating over the recommendations of that community process through its regional planning committee, co-governing with the iwi of the region. And then at the point that council makes some final decisions based on the recommendations of 5 independent commissioners, we're now in a new stage of the process, nearly a decade on from when it started, where we're in the Environment Court, where a number of parties are able to appeal the recommendations of the independent commissioners who follow this enormous process. Now, in my view, we need to have resource management planning processes that let everybody have a say and make sure all of their views and evidence are taken into account. But the people who are elected to make decisions on behalf of the community through the democratic process should be able to get on, make decisions, and then enable us to actually move forward.
So the impediment to that, and I'll say something that you might stridently disagree with, but in my 6 years as a councillor, I'd have to say the impediment to timely, prudent, multi-interest reflecting decision-making, the impediment to that has been local martyrdom. It's been institutionally cluttered by the Regional Planning Committee and its operating rules. The co-governance issue has now been elevated to a real high level of increasing Sturm und Drang and controversy. The Maori community does feel there is a legitimate grievance sitting there as to how this crucial resource has been used, and as far as they're concerned, Pakeha have screwed that up royally. But nevertheless, it seems like it's only going to become more difficult at the local level, not less, and it may take a crisis of some sort to break through this. Now, you'll be entering a central government that has issued a freshwater policy statement that did create a hierarchy that for the first time in terms of how water should be used, and environment does come first in that. Marydom should be quite happy with that, but how that plays out and economic exploitation of the resource is the bottom of that list. So haven't we been told by central government, here's what it's going to be, boys and girls, so get on with it? Is that where we are?
As I said earlier, one of the things that surprised me coming into this role is that despite having the very best intentions around the environment, the level of trust and confidence with key stakeholder groups in the institution is incredibly low. And certainly for our tangata whenua, that is absolutely the reality for both this council, local government and central government nationally, for all the reasons you say. So we start from a position of extremely low trust in our decision making. We're also at a time of great transition where, Māori institutions in terms of representation and governance have been through, a terrible period of colonisation where there's decimation of the traditional structures of leadership and of governance. And they are being rebuilt through the renaissance of Te Ao Māori and Te Reo and Māori culture, and through the treaty settlement process that's creating new institutions to represent Māoridom. And that is a journey which Māori are going on to be effective participants in decision making. And I think what we've seen with the experience of our regional planning committee is it's early days, and those institutions have been heavily focused on their own settlement processes, are standing up their new capability and capacity. And I think what we need to do as an institution, and I'm really proud to say we have done, is support the development of the capability and capacity to participate within the system, to be part of it. And we're still on that journey. We're going to need to involve our tangata whenua in the environmental monitoring so they can have more trust in the information and evidence that is collected. And we can bring their traditional knowledge, their mātauranga, into the process, so they feel like this is an institution that they're actually part of, so that there is trust and confidence. At that point, I think we're in a better position for making timely decision making. And so what I've observed and learned is a lot of the impediments we've had to getting agreement is often not about the substantive issue on the table, about the environmental limit or the policy that you're discussing. It's actually a broader set of issues about trust and confidence. And so we've got some way to go there, but we have made an enormous amount of progress. And look, that's a journey that the country needs to go on. Personally, I believe that the country needs to have a bigger, deeper conversation about what Articles 1 and 2 in particular of the Treaty of Waitangi are provided for, what rangatiratanga means in our contemporary environment, and how does it sit alongside our representative democratic process, and how to make that work. That's a project for New Zealand. It's not something that I don't think anyone's got any template for. We're building the plane while flying it, really. But I think with goodwill towards listening to one another and with partnership being committed to, as this council has done so, we can build a bridge for a much more trusted conversation, relationship, where we can actually face the really hard issues. And as I said before, the politics is going to be overwhelmed by the physics. And one of our conversations we have with the leadership of Māoridom in the region is that despite all of the effects of colonisation, the promise of the treaty, the difficult things we're working through in terms of governance arrangements and how they work in practice. Meanwhile, the planet's getting hotter and hotter faster, and we've got decimated biodiversity in our region. We're water stretched. So we've got urgent environmental issues, and people are going to have to come together and face those, and we'll probably to some extent have to swallow some of the things of the past. And accept different ways of working. And I think that's as true for Māori as it is for Pākehā as well.
Well, it would occur to me that there's as much difference of opinion within Māoridom, actually. And so from that standpoint, maybe this sounds crass, but as an interest group, Māoridom would be no different than farmers. There are farmers across the entire spectrum in terms of what they consider to be sustainable and how it should be pursued and what they're willing to accept by way of cost to do that and so forth. And this is no different, but by having some processes that sort of guarantee a first in line voice in a way to Māoridom, you also run the risk of the other side losing its trust in the process. So it does seem like a really difficult path you're going to have to hoe. David Parker seems to be a bit wary in some things that he's done and said about how far does co-governance, what does it actually mean, how far does it go, and can it be unduly impeding of making decisions that need to be made before catastrophe strikes. So he'll be your boss, right?
Correct.
Is he your only boss, or is James Shaw one of your bosses? Tell us what you're going to be doing.
Well, I'm watching closely what happens next week with respect to a reshuffle of Cabinet. But as of today, David Parker is the Primary Minister, responsible for the environment portfolio. But James Shaw is a Minister that I serve as the Climate Change Minister, so he's the next most important, if you like. And then there are two Associate Ministers, Kiritapu Allen, who's responsible for some of those issues around Māori rights, interests and governance in the resource management system, and Phil Twyford, who has an associate responsibility around housing supply and how that interacts with the resource management system.
So apart from the normal portfolio of the environment, the climate overlay is then a big. So you guys will be you staff the climate planning for the government, right?
Yes, we do. So we're responsible for the legislation and all of the policy relating to climate change. We also oversee the Climate Change Commission, which is a Crown entity that sits under the ministry.
So they must be preparing a briefing memo for you that'll, if you don't, maybe you've already seen one. But when you land there and you look at the first piece of paper on your desk that says, "Shit, James, here's what's on your plate this week," what do you expect to see on it?
So number one is the resource management reforms. So those are with Select Committee at the moment. Submissions are closing in early February. And so my number one job is to bring the legislation home before the election, which is what the government has committed to doing. And so that's a big job of reconciling the many and varied views that will go to Select Committee. And the government will need to respond to the advice of the Select Committee, and it will need to modify the legislation through the parliamentary process before the election. So that's kind of job number one. We also have a timetable to implement the emissions reduction plan and the national adaptation plan in relation to the Climate Change Commission's carbon budgets it sets and what the government's committed to there. So rolling those two out are incredibly important priorities. Part of my role is that I chair the board of chief executives across government for climate change, and that's a coordination of the whole state sector's response to climate change, and then working obviously with the private sector on that. So that's a key focus. I'll be obviously looking very closely at the ministry's capability and capacity to move into the implementation phase. This last period of government has had a big focus on policy and legislation in climate change and also resource management and fresh water, as we've discussed. The next period for the ministry is going to look very much like about implementing those things on the ground in partnership with local government, industry, tangata whenua. So it's the extent to which the capability of the ministry is geared up for that. That's a key focus for me in this early phase.
So I assume you were offered and took this job pre-Jacinda Ardern's announcement. So you could be operating under one set of priorities and values for the next 9 months, and then all of a sudden face a change in that. How do you deal with that? How do you look forward to that now? That's sort of a change in, oh, wait a minute. It's I could be working for a different team than I expected to be. How do you deal with that?
Well, the role has two dimensions to it. One is the chief executive of the ministry, which is running the advisor to government and the implementer of government policy. But the other aspect is a statutory role that I'm appointed to by the Governor-General, which is the Secretary for the Environment, which is a role created under the Environment Act. And I have responsibility to provide free and frank advice to the government about our environmental issues as a country, and I've got particular responsibilities alongside the government statistician to report in the same way that unemployment or GDP statistics are reported apolitically, to report on the state of our environment, what's happening. And so I have a role, regardless of who's in government, of being the voice, if you like, to some extent for the environment in the government's policy machinery. These are politically neutral roles, so I'm appointed by the Public Service Commission, and coming into it, I was clear this year would be an election year, and there's the possibility of a change of government. For me, the simple job really is to speak impartially and in a free and frank manner to the government about the issues we face, the choices they have with policy, with funding, with legislation to respond to those issues, and then ultimately they make the choices as they're elected to do so, and then my job is to faithfully implement. So the change in Prime Minister may make some difference to the personalities that I'm working with, but the job itself just remains the same.
Yeah, so you don't get canned if there's a change of government.
No, I've signed up for a five-year contract, and in these roles, what's really important is to be aware that the government's the government until it's not, and you serve the government faithfully to that point. But obviously, need to be mindful of the possibility of a change of government, and a change of government would likely come with a 100-day plan, and there'll be a desire to see responsiveness from the public sector. So I will need to prepare the ministry for the possibility of a change of government and be ready to put forward options around how a new government might wish to modify the course that the current government's on.
So without dragging you further into this murk, on the one hand, the National Party would say, like, we would can three waters, for example, a huge reversal of direction. Is there anything in the environmental agenda world that would be that controversial? I mean, that you would expect to see first on their 100-day plan is get rid of that?
I think the biggest impact from a change to a national-led government is likely to be in resource management. The National Party has long spoken about the need to replace the RMA and it being past its use-by date. And there's quite broad political consensus that we need the system to change. Quite how they would see that changed hasn't been disclosed in any great detail, and as we get closer to the election there might be some manifesto commitments or some indication of their policy on that. The initial indications are that they're concerned that the government's proposals are overly complex and will be probably looking to simplify some things. So I would expect to see, if there is a change of government, that the resource management reforms might be altered at the margins, but I think still reform would take place. On climate change, the National Party voted for the Zero Carbon Act and has said that it will adhere to the climate budgets that are produced by the Climate Commission. So I think on climate change we're in a more of a bipartisan space now, and I would expect that largely it will be steady as she goes. But there'll be some choices around the pace of change and where the burden of change in response to climate change falls in the community, and how the costs of some of that are managed. So some changes at the margins there.
Well, good luck with all of that. I want to thank you for your time here with us this morning, and I also want to thank you for your service to Hawke's Bay, which I've had the privilege of observing fairly close on for some part of it at least. And I have to say, with the possibility of a change in government, I'm delighted that you will be in the chair that you will be in. So good luck with that. Thanks again.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you, and thanks for all the great work that Baybuzz does as well, highlighting these issues for our community. It's a very valuable institution for Hawke's Bay to have, and so I wish you all the best for the future.
Thanks for that. Okay.
Cool. Thank you.
All good.